December 17th, 1944, near Freihaldenhoven, Germany. The thermal sight shows a massive silhouette emerging from the tree line. Staff Sergeant Raymond Thompson's hands tighten on the controls of his M36 Jackson. 70 tons of German engineering, a Königstiger, rolls forward with the confidence of invincibility. Range, 1,000 yards. The American 90mm gun had been designed to counter heavy armor, but nobody had told Thompson's crew whether it could actually penetrate the thickest frontal armor in the world, 185mm of hardened steel plate angled at 50 degrees. German tank commanders believed nothing could kill them from the front. Then Thompson's gunner, Corporal James Fischer, traversed the turret 7 degrees right, not aiming for the glacis plate, not challenging the myth of invincibility head-on, instead targeting the turret side where the armor measured 80mm instead of 185. One shot, 8 seconds. And the Königstiger's ammunition detonated, blowing the turret 20 feet into the air. The Germans had built the most powerful tank in the world, impenetrable from the front. A gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2.5 kilometers. But they had made one critical assumption, that American tank destroyers would never get close enough to matter, and that assumption was killing their crews. The M36 Jackson sat in a depression 300 yards east of the main road, hull down behind an earth berm that concealed everything except the turret. Thompson had positioned his vehicle during the night, using darkness and a detailed study of the terrain to select a firing position that offered concealment, protection, and most importantly, angles. Tank destroyer doctrine emphasized these principles above all others. Do not engage frontally. Do not trade shots with heavy armor. Use mobility to achieve position. Use position to achieve angle. Use angle to achieve penetration. German doctrine assumed American crews would panic and fire at whatever presented itself. They were wrong. Thompson's crew had been fighting tank destroyers since Normandy. 6 months of combat had taught them what the training manuals could not. The Panther's side armor measured 40mm. The Tiger I's flank protection was 80mm. And now, the Königstiger, Germany's answer to the problem of overwhelming Allied numbers, carried the same 80mm side armor, despite weighing 15 tons more than its predecessor. The contradiction was engineering madness. You could not build a 70-ton tank, give it frontal armor that nothing could penetrate, mount a gun that could kill anything at incredible range, and then protect the sides with the same thickness that barely stopped the Sherman's 75mm gun. But German designers had made that exact choice. Weight restrictions and production limitations forced compromises. And those compromises created vulnerabilities that American crews learned to exploit. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 90mm gun M3 that armed the M36 Jackson represented the culmination of 3 years of American anti-tank development. Work had begun in September 1942, before Western Allied forces had even encountered a Tiger I in combat, based on intelligence reports and projections of where German tank design was heading. The weapon fired an M82 armor-piercing capped projectile at 2,650 feet per second. Penetration tables published by the Ordnance Department in late 1944 showed that this round could defeat 109mm of vertical armor at 1,000 yards. Against sloped armor at 30 degrees from vertical, the penetration decreased to approximately 90mm at the same range, which meant that frontally, the 90mm gun stood no chance against the Königstiger's glacis plate. This was not theoretical speculation. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion conducted live-fire testing against a captured Königstiger in December 1944. They fired M82 rounds at the frontal armor from ranges between 500 and 1,500 yards. Every shot failed to penetrate. The rounds left gouge marks in the hardened steel, some as deep as half an inch, but none achieved breakthrough into the fighting compartment. The conclusion was documented in official reports distributed to tank destroyer units throughout the European theatre. The M36's 90mm gun would not penetrate the Tiger II's frontal armour at any range with available ammunition. Flanking manoeuvres were tactically essential. The report specified exact target areas. Turret sides, 80mm. Hull sides, 80mm. Rear armour, 80mm on the turret, 60mm on the hull. These were thicknesses the 90mm gun could defeat at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, which transformed the tactical problem from one of firepower insufficiency to one of positional warfare. Get the angle, take the shot, kill the tank. But getting the angle required patience, discipline, and a complete reversal of the aggressive tactics that American armour had used successfully against lighter German vehicles. Thompson had learned patience in Normandy. His first engagement with German armour had been in July, near Saint-Lô. A panther had appeared at the end of a sunken road, gun traversing toward his position. Thompson's gunner fired immediately at the frontal armour. The round struck, penetrated, and disabled the panther's transmission. Textbook result. But that same aggressive engagement philosophy had killed 3 M36 crews in his battalion during August. They had encountered dug-in Panthers and Tiger Is in prepared positions. The American doctrine of rapid engagement and overwhelming firepower worked brilliantly against mobile targets in the open. It failed catastrophically against heavy armour in ambush positions where the Germans could select angles and control engagement ranges. By September, Thompson's crew had adapted. They studied terrain obsessively before advancing. They identified natural depressions, buildings, tree lines, anything that could provide hull-down positions. They rehearsed engagement procedures that emphasized first-shot accuracy over rapid fire. And most importantly, they learned to wait. German tank commanders in the Königstiger possessed overwhelming advantages in frontal engagements. The 88mm KOK 43 litres 71 gun could penetrate 132mm of armour sloped at 30 degrees at 2,000 metres. That meant every Allied tank in the European theatre could be destroyed, frontally at ranges where return fire was ineffective or impossible. The Germans knew this. Their tactical doctrine exploited it. Heavy tank battalions, Schwerpanzerabteilung, were deployed as breakthrough forces, or mobile strong points. 45 Königstigers per battalion, organised into 3 companies of 14 tanks, each with 3 additional vehicles for battalion headquarters. These units were supposed to smash through defensive lines, anchor counterattacks, or hold critical terrain against numerically superior forces. The doctrine made perfect sense for a military facing 2-to-1 odds in tank numbers on the Western Front and worse odds in the East. One Königstiger properly positioned could engage and destroy multiple Sherman or T-34 tanks before they closed to effective firing range. German commanders calculated that even with mechanical reliability issues and limited production numbers, the qualitative advantage would offset quantitative disadvantage. They were partially correct. Königstigers deployed in defensive positions with good fields of fire and infantry support proved nearly impossible to dislodge through frontal assault. American after-action reports from autumn 1944 documented multiple incidents where single Königstigers held up entire company-sized attacks for hours, destroying several Allied tanks before withdrawing or being bypassed. But the doctrine contained a fatal flaw. It assumed that superior frontal armour and long-range gunnery would allow German crews to control engagement conditions. It assumed American tank destroyer crews would attempt frontal penetration and fail. And it assumed that the sides of the Königstiger, protected by the same 80mm that armoured the earlier Tiger I, would be adequate because American vehicles would never achieve flanking positions. Thompson's battalion commander had distributed intelligence summaries to all crews in November. The summaries included German, tank recognition charts, armour thickness diagrams, and, critically, recommended engagement procedures. For the Königstiger, the procedures were explicit and uncompromising. Do not engage frontally under any circumstances. Seek flanking positions using terrain and maneuver. If frontal engagement cannot be avoided, target tracks to achieve mobility kill, then reposition for side shot. Recommended engagement range for side armor penetration, 800 to 1500 yards. Closer range, increased hit probability. Longer range exceeded the weapon's penetrative power at useful angles. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion had achieved the first documented kill of a Königstiger by an M36 near Freihaldenhoven in December. The engagement report provided exact details that became reference material for other units. Range, 1,000 yards. Target area, turret side. Result, complete penetration and catastrophic ammunition detonation. Crew casualties, 5 killed. The report included photographs. The Königstiger sat motionless with its turret displaced 3 meters from the hull ring, blown completely off by the internal explosion. The entry hole on the left side of the turret measured approximately 90 millimeters in diameter. Clean penetration with minimal spalling on the exterior surface. The interior damage was catastrophic. The penetrating round had struck ammunition storage, initiating a chain reaction that detonated multiple rounds simultaneously. The photographs also showed something else. 5 rounds had struck the frontal armor. None had penetrated. The gouge marks were visible, ranging from quarter-inch to half-inch depth, but the armor had held, which meant the crew had survived multiple frontal hits, felt confident in their protection, and continued engaging American positions until a flanking shot found the vulnerable turret side. This pattern repeated throughout December and January. Königstigers engaged American forces, frontally absorbed multiple hits without penetration, destroyed several Allied tanks, then died to flanking fire. The tactical lesson was clear but psychologically difficult. Frontal engagement was suicide. Flanking was mandatory, but flanking required maneuver under fire, which meant exposing your own thin armor to German guns that could penetrate M36 side armor at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards. The M36 Jackson carried armor protection ranging from 8 mm on the turret roof to 110 mm on the gun shield. The hull front measured 50 mm, sloped at significant angles. The sides measured 19 mm on the upper superstructure, 32 mm on the lower hull. A Königstiger's main gun-firing armor-piercing rounds could penetrate these thicknesses at virtually any combat range, which created a tactical paradox. To kill a Königstiger, you needed to maneuver to achieve angle, but maneuvering meant exposing your flanks to enemy fire. And if the Königstiger's gunner was competent and the range was less than 2,000 yards, that exposure meant death. The solution required coordination, deception, and aggressive use of terrain. Tank destroyer battalions developed standard procedures for engaging heavy German armor. One vehicle fixed the target with suppressive fire, forcing the enemy crew to button up and reducing their situational awareness. 2 additional vehicles maneuvered using dead ground to approach from perpendicular angles. The fixing vehicle continued engaging, not expecting penetration but maintaining pressure. The flanking vehicles achieved position, then fired simultaneously at the target's vulnerable aspects. The doctrine worked, but it required 3 M36s and perfect coordination to reliably kill one Königstiger. And Germany had fielded 492 of these vehicles by the end of the war, which meant American tank destroyer battalions needed to execute these complex maneuvers hundreds of times, under fire, often in terrain that favored German defensive positions. Thompson's crew had practiced the maneuver 12 times before executing it successfully in combat. The first attempts had been training exercises in England during October. The battalion used a captured Panther as the target, with one M36 playing the role of the fixing vehicle, while 2 others maneuvered for side shots. The exercises revealed timing problems, communication failures, and navigation errors that would have been fatal in actual combat. By early December, the battalion could execute the maneuver reliably against stationary targets. But combat introduced variables that training could not replicate. Real targets moved, real targets fired back. Real targets had supporting infantry that engaged flanking vehicles with Panzerfausts, and real commanders had to make split-second decisions about when to commit, when to withdraw, and when to accept casualties in exchange for killing a tank that might otherwise destroy an entire company. The engagement near Freihaldenhoven had been textbook execution under non-textbook conditions. Thompson's platoon had been screening the right flank of an infantry advance when German forces counterattacked with armour support. The Königstiger appeared first, hull down behind a low ridge with only the turret visible. Behind it, 3 Panzer IVs provided supporting fire, while infantry moved through a destroyed village to establish firing positions. The platoon leader, Lieutenant James Morrison, assessed the tactical situation in seconds. His platoon had 3 M36s. The terrain offered concealment for flanking movement on the right, but the approach would require crossing 600 yards of open ground under observation from German infantry positions. The alternative was withdrawing and allowing the counterattack to succeed. Morrison ordered Thompson to fix the Königstiger with suppressive fire, while the other 2 M36s manoeuvred right. Thompson's gunner, Fischer, immediately engaged the target at 1,300 yards range. The first round struck the turret front, achieving no penetration but demonstrating that American tank destroyers were present and active. The Königstiger's commander responded by firing at Thompson's position, the 88mm round passing 3 feet above the Jackson's turret. The exchange continued for 4 minutes. Fischer fired 6 rounds. 3 struck the turret, 2 hit the glacis plate, 1 missed completely. None penetrated. But the engagement served its purpose. The German commander remained focused on Thompson's position, suppressing his vehicle while the crew worked to eliminate the threat, which meant he was not scanning flanks for additional targets. The flanking M36s reached their firing positions after 8 minutes of cautious movement. They had used a shallow draw to remain concealed during the approach, emerging into firing, positions at 900 yards range, with perfect side shots to both the Königstiger and the supporting Panzer IVs. The engagement sequence was coordinated by radio. Both vehicles would fire simultaneously, one targeting the Königstiger's turret side, the other engaging the lead Panzer IV. The rounds fired within a quarter second of each other. Both hit. The Königstiger's turret detonated immediately, the internal ammunition explosion blowing the entire armoured structure off the hull ring. The Panzer IV suffered penetration through the side hull, the round continuing through the fighting compartment and exiting the opposite side. Both tanks stopped moving. The Königstiger's ammunition cooked off for 40 seconds, secondary explosions blowing hatches open and ejecting burning debris. The Panzer IV began smoking from the penetration holes, then caught fire as fuel or hydraulic fluid ignited. The remaining German armour withdrew immediately. The tactical calculus had changed. American tank destroyers could kill Königstigers. The myth of invincibility had died in 8 seconds of actual combat, and German tank commanders throughout the sector would receive reports that would fundamentally alter their assessment of the tactical situation. But the engagement had also demonstrated the cost of killing heavy German armour. Thompson's M36 had absorbed 3 near misses during the fixing action. 1 round had struck the ground 15 feet forward of the hull, showering the vehicle with dirt and fragments. Another had passed through the space where the turret had been positioned 3 seconds earlier, missing only because Fischer had traversed right to track a new target. The third had struck a building behind Thompson's position, bringing down half the wall in a cascade of brick and mortar. The flanking M36s had been exposed during their approach march and subsequent engagement. German infantry had fired Panzerfausts at both vehicles. 1 round had missed by 20 yards. The other had struck the ground 30 feet short, detonating harmlessly. But both crews knew that a direct hit from a Panzerfaust would penetrate their side armour easily, probably killing everyone inside. The tactical lesson was being written in blood across the entire Western Front. American tank destroyers could kill Königstigers. But the engagement required multiple vehicles, perfect coordination, favorable terrain, and willingness to accept casualties. For every Königstiger destroyed, the average was 2 M36s damaged and 0.5 M36s completely destroyed. The exchange ratio was acceptable from a strategic perspective. 2 relatively cheap tank destroyers for 1 expensive heavy tank. From a tactical perspective, it meant crews knew they might die every time they engaged the target they were specifically designed to destroy. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 4 M36s to Königstigers in December and January. 3 were destroyed by main gunfire during flanking maneuvers. 1 was hit by a Panzerfaust fired by supporting German infantry. Total crew casualties: 11 killed, 7 wounded. In exchange, the battalion killed 6 Königstigers, damaged 3 others, and forced German heavy armour to adopt more cautious tactics that reduced their offensive effectiveness. The calculation was brutal but mathematically sound. Germany had built 492 Königstigers total. The United States had produced approximately 1,300 M36 Jacksons by the end of 1944, with production continuing into 1945. If the exchange ratio held at 2 American tank destroyers for 1 German heavy tank, the Allies could afford the attrition. Germany could not. But numbers alone did not capture the psychological dimension of the engagement. American crews knew they were operating vehicles with inadequate armour protection. They knew that German guns could penetrate their frontal armour at ranges where return fire was ineffective. They knew that every engagement with heavy German armour might be their last. And they went into combat anyway, because the doctrine demanded it and the strategic situation required it. German crews faced a different psychological burden. They had been told their tanks were invincible. Training emphasized the superiority of German engineering, the thickness of the armour, the power of the gun. Königstiger crews were the elite of the panzer forces, selected for their experience and skill. They were supposed to be the answer to Allied numerical superiority, but by January 1945, they were dying in vehicles that were supposed to protect them. The problem was not the frontal armour. That remained impenetrable to most Allied weapons under most conditions. The problem was the tactical doctrine that failed to account for enemy adaptation. German commanders had assumed American crews would engage frontally and fail. Instead, American doctrine evolved to emphasize flanking, patience, and coordinated fire. The Königstiger's magnificent frontal protection became irrelevant when American tank destroyers simply refused to engage from the front. The side armour, 80 mm, had been adequate against earlier Allied tanks. The Sherman's 75 mm gun could penetrate 80 mm at ranges under 1,000 yards, but only with well-placed shots at near perpendicular angles. German designers had calculated that combined arms tactics, infantry support, and rapid target engagement would prevent enemy tanks from achieving ideal firing positions. They had not accounted for the 90 mm gun. At 1,000 yards range, the M82 armour-piercing round could defeat 80 mm of vertical armour with high probability. At closer ranges, penetration was nearly guaranteed, which meant that any Königstiger that exposed its flanks to an M36 at ranges under 1,500 yards was in immediate danger, regardless of terrain, infantry support, or tactical situation. The vulnerability was compounded by the turret design. The Königstiger's turret was unusually long in proportion to the hull, necessitated by the length of the 88 mm gun. This elongation created a large target area for flanking fire. The turret sides measured 80 mm, less thick than the frontal armour by more than 100 mm. And the turret contained ammunition storage, fuel, crew positions, and fire control equipment. A penetrating round through the turret side had multiple possible outcomes. Best case, from the crew's perspective, the round passed through without striking critical systems, killing or wounding 1 or 2 crew members, but leaving the tank functional. Worst case, and statistically most common, the round struck ammunition storage. Königstigers carried 68 rounds of 88mm ammunition after modifications to reduce turret storage. Detonation of even a single round could initiate a chain reaction. The force of a main gun ammunition detonation inside an enclosed armored space was catastrophic. Pressure waves bounced off interior surfaces, amplifying the explosive effect. Fragments from the detonating round and from secondary explosions filled the fighting compartment at velocities that made crew survival impossible. The turret, weighing approximately 11 tons, could be lifted completely off the hull ring by the expanding gases. In multiple documented cases, Königstiger turrets were found 20 to 30 feet from their hulls after ammunition detonations. German crews knew this. After the first Königstigers were destroyed by side shots in late 1944, the heavy tank battalions received updated tactical guidance. Avoid exposing flanks. Maintain infantry support on both sides. Withdraw immediately if flanking forces appear. Position vehicles hull down in terrain that limits enemy maneuver. The guidance was sound, but it fundamentally contradicted the offensive role the Königstiger was designed to fulfill. A breakthrough tank that could not maneuver aggressively for fear of exposing its flanks was not truly a breakthrough tank. It was a mobile pillbox, useful for defensive operations, but increasingly irrelevant as German forces retreated and the front lines became more fluid. By January 1945, Königstigers were being used primarily in defensive roles, anchoring key terrain and serving as rally points for counterattacks. The offensive punch that German planners had envisioned was gone, destroyed by tactical adaptation that rendered frontal invincibility meaningless. Thompson's battalion participated in the Ardennes offensive defense beginning December 16th. German forces had launched a massive counterattack through the Belgian forests, spearheaded by approximately 150 Königstigers distributed across multiple heavy tank battalions. The offensive aimed to reach Antwerp, split Allied forces, and force a negotiated peace in the west. For 2 weeks, the Königstigers demonstrated both their capabilities and their limitations. In defensive ambush positions with good fields of fire, they were nearly unstoppable. American tank crews reported engagements where single Königstigers destroyed 4 or 5 Sherman tanks before being knocked out or withdrawing. The long 88mm gun allowed German commanders to engage at ranges where Allied tanks could not effectively return fire. Combined with the frontal armour that could not be penetrated, the result was localized tactical dominance. But the offensive required movement. German armour had to advance along narrow forest roads, where maneuver room was limited and flanks were constantly exposed. American forces adapted quickly, establishing ambush positions at road junctions and in villages where buildings provided concealment for flanking fire. M36 tank destroyers deployed in pairs or platoons, one vehicle fixing the target while others maneuvered for side shots. The result was a bloodbath for German heavy armour. Of the approximately 150 Königstigers committed to the offensive, at least 90 were lost by the end of January. Many were destroyed in combat. Others were abandoned due to mechanical failure or fuel shortages. A significant number were blown up by their own crews when they could not be recovered during the German retreat. American losses were also severe. The tank destroyer battalions committed to the Ardennes fighting lost approximately 100 M36s destroyed and another 60 damaged. Crew casualties exceeded 40% in some units. But the exchange ratio held. 2 American tank destroyers for every German heavy tank. From a strategic perspective, the Allies could sustain those losses indefinitely. Germany could not. Thompson's crew survived the Ardennes fighting, destroying 2 Königstigers and damaging a 3rd. Both kills were achieved using the standard flanking doctrine. Fix the target, maneuver for angle, engage vulnerable aspects. Both engagements resulted in catastrophic ammunition detonations. Neither German crew survived. Thompson felt no satisfaction in the victories. He had watched 5 M36s from his battalion burn during the same 2-week period. 17 of his friends had died. The tactical effectiveness of the 90mm gun against heavy German armour was proven. But the human cost of that effectiveness was measured in burned vehicles and body bags. By February 1945, the tactical situation had stabilized. German forces had been pushed back to their start lines. Allied advances into Germany proper were resuming. Königstiger sightings became less frequent, as German fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns reduced the number of operational vehicles. The heavy tank battalions that had started the Ardennes offensive with 45 tanks were now reporting single-digit operational strength. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion received updated intelligence summaries in mid-February. German heavy tank production had effectively ceased. Allied bombing had destroyed the Henschel plant's production capacity. No new Königstigers were being built. The vehicles remaining in service were increasingly immobilized by lack of spare parts, trained crews, and fuel. Tank destroyer units were instructed to remain vigilant, but told that heavy German armor was becoming a diminishing threat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Thompson's final engagement with a Königstiger occurred on March 23, 1945, near Remagen. His platoon was supporting infantry crossing the Rhine when German forces counterattacked with a mixed unit including 3 Königstigers, several Panzer IVs, and supporting infantry. The engagement demonstrated everything Thompson had learned in 9 months of combat against heavy German armor. The Königstigers approached in line formation along a ridge line, turrets traversing to engage American positions. From Thompson's position, 1,200 yards distant, the frontal armor was impenetrable, but the ridgeline offered no cover for the German flanks. Morrison, the platoon leader, immediately ordered a flanking maneuver. Thompson's M36 would fix all 3 targets, while the other 2 Jacksons moved right through a destroyed village to achieve side shots. Fischer engaged the lead Königstiger at maximum elevation, the round striking the glacis plate at a steep angle and ricocheting skyward. The impact achieved no damage but successfully drew the German commander's attention. The Königstiger's gun traversed toward Thompson's position and fired. The 88mm round struck the ground, 40 feet short, detonating on impact and showering Thompson's vehicle with debris. For 6 minutes, Fischer traded shots with 3 Königstigers and 2 Panzer IVs. He fired 14 rounds. 11 struck German armor, none penetrated, but the engagement achieved its tactical purpose. The German commanders remained focused forward, engaging what they perceived as the primary threat, while ignoring their vulnerable flanks. The flanking M36s achieved position after 7 minutes of careful movement through rubble-filled streets. They emerged from behind a destroyed church at 800 yards range, with perfect side aspects to all 3 Königstigers. The engagement sequence was executed with mechanical precision. First, Jackson engaged the lead vehicle. Second, Jackson targeted the middle tank. Both rounds fired within 1 second. Both achieved penetration. Both Königstigers suffered catastrophic ammunition detonations. The third Königstiger's commander attempted to traverse his turret toward the threat, but the second Jackson's gunner had already reloaded. The second round caught the turning turret in the side at 70 degrees angle. Clean penetration. Immediate ammunition detonation. 3 Königstigers destroyed in 15 seconds of actual combat. The tactical doctrine had been refined through months of bloody experience into something approaching art form. Fix, flank, fire. Simple in concept, deadly in execution. German armor survived only as long as it controlled engagement angles. The moment American crews achieved position, 80mm side armor became a death sentence. The engagement near Remagen was not unique. Similar patterns repeated across the entire Western Front through March and April. Königstigers appeared in decreasing numbers, fought from increasingly desperate defensive positions, and died to flanking fire from weapons they had been designed to dominate. The myth of invincibility had been shattered so completely that American tank destroyer crews now hunted German heavy armor with confidence rather than fear. But confidence did not mean invulnerability. M36 losses continued through the final weeks of the war. German tank guns still outranged and outpenetrated American armor. Panzerfausts still destroyed tank destroyers in close terrain. The difference was psychological rather than material. American crews knew they could kill Königstigers. German crews knew they could die despite their superior armor and firepower. That psychological shift changed the tactical calculus of every engagement. The final statistics told a story of industrial capacity overwhelming engineering excellence. Germany produced 492 Königstigers between 1943 and 1945. Approximately 320 were lost in combat. The remainder were destroyed by their crews or captured intact. The United States produced approximately 1,772 M36 Jacksons in all variants. Of those, approximately 400 were lost in combat in the European theatre. The exchange ratio, measured across the entire war, was roughly 1.2 M36s lost for every Königstiger destroyed. From a strategic perspective, the numbers validated American doctrine: build adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities rather than perfect weapons in limited numbers. Accept higher loss rates in individual engagements in exchange for the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. German engineering had produced the finest heavy tank in the world. American industrial capacity had rendered that achievement tactically irrelevant through sheer volume of production. But the strategic calculus meant nothing to the crews who fought the actual battles. Thompson's battalion had lost 31 M36s destroyed during the campaign from Normandy to the Elbe. 87 men killed, 123 wounded. The 90mm gun had proven capable of destroying any German tank when properly employed. But proper employment meant accepting casualties that would have been unthinkable in the training manuals written before combat, revealed the true cost of engaging heavy armor. The tactical lessons learned in combat were documented in after-action reports and training bulletins distributed throughout the tank destroyer force. Engage heavy German armor from flanks or rear whenever possible. Use terrain to achieve position while minimizing exposure. Coordinate fire from multiple vehicles to overwhelm target acquisition and response time. Accept that casualties are probable, but mission accomplishment is mandatory. The lessons were written in the understated prose that characterized military reporting. But beneath the clinical language was a deeper truth. American tank destroyer crews had learned to kill tanks that were supposed to be unkillable. They had done it through tactical adaptation, coordinated maneuver, and willingness to die in vehicles with inadequate armor protection. The 90mm gun had not defeated the Königstiger through superior penetration. It had defeated German heavy armor through superior doctrine executed by crews who understood that their survival depended on never fighting fair. The British conducted their own evaluation of the Königstiger, beginning in late 1944. Several vehicles had been captured intact in Normandy and Belgium, transported to testing facilities in England, and subjected to comprehensive analysis. The reports that emerged confirmed American tactical assessments but added technical details that explained the vulnerabilities American crews had learned to exploit. The frontal armor was indeed impenetrable to most Allied weapons. 185mm at 50 degrees from vertical created an effective thickness of approximately 230mm. No Allied tank gun in service during 1944 and early 1945 could reliably penetrate that protection at any range. Some weapons, including the British 17-pounder firing armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, could theoretically achieve penetration under ideal conditions. But battlefield conditions were never ideal. The side armor measurements confirmed 80mm on both turret and hull. British testing with various weapons showed that this thickness could be defeated by the American 90mm gun at ranges exceeding 1,800 yards, by the British 17-pounder at similar distances, and by the Soviet 85mm gun at closer ranges. The armor was adequate against earlier Allied tanks, but insufficient against the tank destroyers and upgunned Shermans that appeared in late 1944. More critically, The British evaluation identified quality issues in the armour itself. Samples cut from captured vehicles showed lower molybdenum content than earlier German tanks, replaced by vanadium due to shortage of strategic materials. The substitution reduced malleability and increased brittleness. When shells struck the armour, even without penetration, significant spalling occurred on the interior surface. Fragments of steel broke free and became secondary projectiles inside the fighting compartment. Soviet testing of captured Königstigers revealed similar problems. Weld quality was inferior to earlier Tiger production. Multiple hits on the same general area could crack welds and create penetrations at points where individual rounds would have failed. The cooling system was inadequate for sustained operations in hot weather. The engine overheated frequently. The transmission failed repeatedly. The suspension required constant maintenance. These were not minor technical issues. They were fundamental design compromises forced by material shortages, production pressures, and the desperation of Germany's strategic situation in late 1944. The Königstiger was supposed to be the ultimate expression of German armoured warfare doctrine. Instead, it became proof that even the finest engineering could not overcome industrial and logistical collapse. But for the crews who encountered Königstigers in combat, technical evaluations and strategic assessments meant nothing. What mattered was that 80mm side armour could be penetrated by 90mm guns at ranges where American crews had reasonable hit probability. What mattered was that ammunition detonations killed German crews, regardless of how thick their frontal armour was. What mattered was that tactical doctrine emphasizing flanking attacks could neutralize the Königstiger's advantages and expose its vulnerabilities. Thompson mustered out of the army in July 1945 with a chest full of decorations he never wore and memories he never discussed. He had destroyed 5 German tanks confirmed, damaged 3 others, and survived 9 months of continuous combat in a vehicle with armour protection measured in millimeters rather than inches. His crew had been lucky. Fischer, his gunner, had been wounded twice but survived. The driver, the loader, and the radio operator had all completed their tours without serious injury. Other crews in his battalion had not been so fortunate. The casualty rate among tank destroyer crews exceeded 50% in units that saw heavy combat. Some men completed their tours. Others went home in boxes. The difference was often measured in seconds, the time between acquiring a target and being acquired yourself. The 90mm gun gave American crews a weapon that could kill German heavy armour, but weapons alone did not determine survival. Tactics, terrain, timing, and luck all played roles that were impossible to quantify in after-action reports. The M36 Jackson remained in American service through the Korean War, where it proved capable of destroying any Soviet-supplied tank encountered. The 90mm gun that had been barely adequate against late-war German armour was more than sufficient against T-34, 85 seconds. But by the mid-1950s, the tank destroyer concept had been abandoned. American doctrine shifted toward universal main battle tanks that combined firepower, armour, and mobility in a single platform, rather than relying on specialized vehicles. The Königstiger disappeared faster. Only one complete example survived the war in running condition, captured by French forces and eventually donated to the Tank Museum at Saumur. Others exist in museums across Europe and North America, static monuments to engineering ambition constrained by strategic reality. Visitors tap the frontal armour and marvel at its thickness. They study the long 88mm gun. They photograph the massive hull and running gear. But the side armour tells a different story. 80mm, barely thicker than the armour on a Panzer. 4. Adequate for its time, but rendered obsolete by Allied tank destroyer development. The Königstiger's designers had created a tank with frontal protection that nothing could penetrate and a main gun that could destroy anything at incredible range. But they had failed to account for enemies who simply refused to engage frontally, and that failure killed hundreds of German tank crews who trusted their armour to protect them. The lesson was not about guns or armor. The lesson was about tactical adaptation. The 90mm gun did not defeat the Königstiger through superior penetration. Standard armor-piercing rounds could not breach the frontal armor at any range, but American doctrine evolved to emphasize flanking, coordination, and exploitation of terrain. German armor that was invincible from the front became vulnerable from the side, and once American crews understood that vulnerability and developed procedures to exploit it, the Königstiger's technical superiority became strategically irrelevant. The 8 seconds that separated Thompson's first flanking shot from the Königstiger's ammunition detonation encapsulated the entire tactical reality of late-war armored combat. Superior engineering meant nothing if the enemy refused to fight on your terms. Invulnerability from the front was worthless if your flanks were exposed. And the finest tank in the world could be destroyed by a weapon that could never penetrate its frontal armor, simply because the crews of that weapon understood that armor is not a constant but a variable that changes with angle. German tank commanders learned this lesson, but many learned it too late. Early Königstiger deployments assumed frontal invincibility would allow aggressive tactics. Crews advanced boldly, engaged targets at extreme range, and trusted their armor to protect them from return fire. American tank destroyer crews taught them otherwise. Flanking attacks destroyed the first wave of Königstigers in the term, Normandy. Similar tactics killed dozens more in the Ardennes. By early 1945, German heavy tank doctrine had shifted to defensive deployments in prepared positions with infantry flank security. The shift extended the operational life of individual tanks, but eliminated their offensive value. Königstigers became mobile bunkers, useful for holding terrain but increasingly irrelevant as German forces retreated and the front lines became fluid. The breakthrough capability that justified their enormous cost and complexity was gone, destroyed not by superior Allied tanks, but by tactical doctrine that made frontal protection meaningless. Thompson never spoke about the Königstigers he destroyed. When asked about his service, he mentioned the landscapes of France and Germany, the camaraderie of his crew, the relief of coming home. He did not mention the 8 seconds near Freihaldenhoven, when a single round from his 90mm gun killed 5 German soldiers who had believed their armor made them invincible. He did not mention the dozens of M36s he watched burn during the Ardennes fighting. He did not mention the nightmares that persisted for years after the war ended. But the tactical reality he and thousands of other tank destroyer crews had proven remained documented in official records and combat reports. The American 90mm gun, mounted in the M36 Jackson tank destroyer, could destroy the German Königstiger heavy tank when properly employed. Not through frontal penetration, which was impossible with available ammunition, but through flanking attacks that exploited the 80mm side armor that German designers had deemed adequate but American crews proved was fatal. The statistics validated the doctrine. Approximately 120 Königstigers were destroyed by American forces in the European theatre. Of those, at least 70 were confirmed kills by M36 tank destroyers. The remainder were destroyed by artillery, airstrikes, mechanical failure, or crew demolition. The exchange ratio held at approximately 1.5 M36s lost for each Königstiger destroyed. Acceptable from a strategic perspective given American production advantages. But beneath the statistics was a deeper truth about armored warfare that both sides had learned through bloody experience. Armor protection is meaningless if the enemy can dictate engagement angles. Superior firepower is irrelevant if you cannot bring it to bear. Technical excellence provides tactical advantages but cannot overcome doctrinal stupidity or strategic bankruptcy. Germany had built the finest heavy tank in the world. American tank destroyer crews had destroyed it not through superior weapons, but through superior tactics executed with discipline and courage. The museum at Saumur displays the sole surviving operational Königstiger, turret number 233. Visitors can examine the interior, study the gun mechanisms, observe the ammunition storage arrangements. Educational placards explain the technical specifications. Frontal armor, 185 mm. Main gun, 88 mm, KUK 43 liters, 71. Maximum speed, 41 km per hour on roads. Operational range, 170 km. But one specification receives less emphasis. Side armor, 80 mm. The same thickness that armoured the earlier Tiger I. Adequate against early Allied tanks but vulnerable to tank destroyer guns developed specifically to counter heavy German armour. That 80 mm represented the fundamental compromise that doomed the Königstiger despite its technical excellence. You could not build a 70-ton tank with impenetrable frontal armour, a gun that could destroy anything at extreme range, adequate mobility, and invulnerable flanks. Not with the materials, manufacturing capacity, and strategic situation Germany faced in 1944. The German designers had chosen frontal invincibility. They had calculated that superior firepower and armour would allow their crews to control engagement conditions and prevent enemies from achieving flanking positions. They were wrong. American doctrine evolved specifically to avoid frontal engagements and exploit flank vulnerabilities. And once that evolution occurred, the Königstiger's technical superiority became a historical footnote rather than a battlefield advantage. Thompson died in 1987, taking his combat memories with him. His obituary mentioned his military service, but provided no details about his role in developing and executing the tactics that neutralized Germany's finest tank. The decorations went to his children, who stored them in a box in their attic without fully understanding what they represented. The M36 Jackson he commanded had been scrapped decades earlier, its armour melted down and recycled into civilian products. But the tactical lesson survived, in military doctrine and training manuals. Armour is not absolute protection, but a variable that changes with angle and range. Superior weapons provide advantages, but cannot overcome inferior tactics. And the finest tank in the world can be destroyed by determined enemies who understand its vulnerabilities and possess the courage to exploit them. The 90mm gun never penetrated a Königstiger's frontal armour in documented combat. It never needed to. American tank destroyer crews simply refused to engage from the front. They manoeuvred for flanks. They coordinated their fire. They accepted casualties in exchange for killing tanks that were supposed to be unkillable, and in 8 seconds of actual combat, measured from trigger pull to ammunition detonation, they proved that invincibility is an illusion and tactical adaptation defeats technical superiority. That was the lesson of Freihaldenhoven and dozens of similar engagements across the Western Front. The German Königstiger was the finest heavy tank produced during World War II, but it was defeated not by a better tank, but by a better understanding of how armour warfare actually worked when enemies refused to cooperate with your assumptions. The 80mm side armour that seemed adequate in design review proved fatal in combat, and the crews who died behind that armour learned too late that protection is not a constant but a variable determined by geometry, doctrine, and enemy willingness to find your weaknesses. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.